there's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. Hello, True Crime Conversations listeners. Today, I wanted to share with you another episode of Mamamia's news podcast, The Quickie. In this episode, Claire Murphy delves into a case that has rocked France and sparked protests outside the courthouse in Avignon. For 50 years, Dominique and Giselle Pellicot were married. But for a decade of their union, Giselle was unknowingly drugged and repeatedly assaulted by dozens of men. An unimaginable betrayal. Now, as a survivor, she's speaking out, seeking justice and fighting to be heard. In this episode, Claire speaks with a clinical forensic psychologist and criminal lawyer about the legal protections for victim survivors and what would happen if this case were to unfold here in Australia. Let us know what you think about the episode and if it's helped you to be better informed about the case.
Hi, I'm Claire Murphy. This is Mamamia's daily news podcast, The Quickie. Just a warning, this episode deals with a rape case that is currently underway in France. It includes descriptions of sexual assault. If this is a tough topic for you, please take care when listening. In September 2020, a man was caught secretly filming under women's skirts at a shopping centre in France. What police would discover after his arrest would lead to a rape trial involving another 50 men. Today, we'll delve into the case of Dominique Pellicot and the men he recruited into his sick, twisted world. For many years, Giselle was struggling with her health. She'd been losing hair, losing weight, and her memory was failing. She'd sometimes feel like whole days would pass of which she would have little to no recollection. Her friends and her children became concerned that she may be suffering from Alzheimer's after seeing her sit for hours in what seemed like a trance. But all of these health conditions would come into razor-sharp focus after her husband was arrested in a local shopping centre near where they lived in France. It was 2020 and Dominique Pellicot had been caught filming up women's skirts. When police searched his computer, they made a shocking discovery. Hundreds of photos and videos showing his unconscious wife being sexually assaulted by numerous men. Investigators also found online chat logs where Dominic had recruited strangers to come to his home and have sex with his sedated wife. He allegedly gave explicit instructions to avoid wearing cologne or smelling of cigarettes and to leave immediately if she showed any signs of waking. Giselle, now in her 70s, had no memory or knowledge of the assaults. That was until police told her. For years, she'd experienced these unexplained health issues and memory loss. In reality, she was being repeatedly drugged and assaulted. Prosecutors say Dominic began these assaults on his wife all the way back in 2011 when they lived near Paris. The abuse continued after they moved to Mazan in Provence in 2013. Dominic allegedly crushing up powerful tranquilizers and anti-anxiety medications and putting it into Giselle's food and wine. Medical experts who examined the evidence said her level of sedation was closer to a coma than it was to sleep. Dominic would then invite men he met through those online forums to come to their home and assault his unconscious wife. He would also participate in and film many of the rapes himself. The videos show him using degrading language to encourage the others. 50 of those men have been tracked down and are on trial with the accused, but the other 21 are yet to be identified from the footage. Giselle says she recognised just one of them, a man who had come to their home to discuss cycling with her husband. She would regularly say hello to him at their local bakery. Never did she think that he would come to her home and allegedly rape her. No money ever changed hands. The other participants claim they believed that they were engaging in consensual activities with a libertine couple. However, Dominic reportedly told investigators that all the men were aware that his wife had been drugged without her knowledge. None of them were asked to wear a condom while allegedly raping Giselle. She contracted 4 sexually transmitted infections as a result. The victim survivor, who is now divorcing Dominic, made the brave decision to request a public trial. Her lawyer stated she wants to raise awareness as widely as possible of what happened to her so that events like this never happen again. The case has sparked national outrage in France and raised serious questions about consent, predatory behaviour, and how such extensive abuse could have gone undetected for so long. Some lawmakers hope it will lead to changes in how French law defines rape and consent. The trial has also prompted discussions about cultural attitudes in France regarding sexual crimes and consent. As one French lawmaker told the New York Times, there's a kind of naivete on the topic of predators in France, a kind of denial. Giselle told the court that despite the horror she felt after they showed her disturbing photos of herself naked and being abused by men, she credits the police with saving her life. Over 90 minutes of testimony, she recalled the photos as scenes of horror, saying they treated her like a rag doll. She explained that not a single one of these men alerted police, saying even one anonymous phone call could have saved her. When the defence asked her about whether she and her husband actually had an open relationship, and how is it she could have not noticed anything after a decade of this occurring, she responded swiftly, saying, "Don't talk to me about sex scenes. These are rape scenes." She says she was never complicit and isn't just pretending to be asleep. She turned to the accused in court and said, for once in your lives at least, take responsibility for your actions. Giselle says she will never forget the sound that her daughter made when she told her. She let out a howl, she said, whose sound is still etched on my mind. Giselle's daughter Caroline described her father as probably one of the worst sexual criminals of the past 20 years, telling the court the day she found out about her mother's ordeal was like a slow descent into hell, having to call her brothers and explain what had happened. She left the court in tears on the second day of the trial as the judge recounted how naked photo montages of Caroline had also been found on her father's computer in a folder called Around My Daughter Naked. This case has captured the world's attention for all the wrong reasons. It's shocking, it's terrifying, and it makes us wonder what laws would protect us here in Australia if we were to be drugged and assaulted. Dr. Brianna Chesser is an Associate Professor of Criminology and Justice at RMIT, a clinical forensic psychologist and criminal lawyer. Brianna, when we see stories like the one coming out of France since this trial began last week, it makes us wonder what laws are protecting us here in Australia. What would that trial look like if it happened here? Because what I'm seeing is that it depends on where you live because these kinds of laws are decided on a state and territory level.
Well, in the last 5 or so years, we've really had quite a number of changes to many of the state and territories' sex offences legislation. It was for the inclusion of things like stealthing, rape by compelling, and the administration of an intoxicating substance for a sexual purpose. New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland and South Australia in particular have versions of those particular offences, but there'd be an argument that even in the other jurisdictions that don't specifically prohibit the administration of an intoxicating substance, what they will have is a common law background of really what the definition of consent is. Even at common law, so cases that sort of have passed down that judges rely on when they're making their judgments, consent is a voluntary, freely willed action that is taken by someone who is participating in a sexual act. So in this case, it would be the wife would have to be voluntarily giving her consent to whatever acts were going to be, well, in this case, that she was subjected to.
So to be clear too, because in this case, these defendants are saying that, well, the husband gave us the consent, even though he's come back and claimed that they knew full well that she had been drugged without her permission. But in any instance, somebody else can't grant consent for you, can they?
Correct. She would have to have given that consent willingly, freely, and of herself. Now, I don't quite know what the laws in France are like in terms of the sort of marriage, but certainly in Australia, women are not owned by their husbands. Women have the right to consent to any act that they freely choose to do so within the marriage or externally to the marriage, and neither the husband nor the wife can make those decisions on behalf of the other. So not really a defence at all, in my opinion.
Brianna, how much are we seeing technology becoming a part of sexual assault here in Australia? Because this is something that the French community have to come to terms with, is just how much of this was documented and shared and how these people were recruited through online forums. How much is technology playing a role in sexual assault here?
Look, I think the rates are absolutely alarming and increasing, where what we're seeing is that technology is involved in every stage of the planning, recruitment, execution of the sexual act, and then quite often in the continued torment of the victim survivor with the production of pornographic material, as was the case with the French trial that we're currently watching.
Do we know what the process is here in Australia? Because what Giselle says, who's the victim survivor here, is that police made her look at photos and videos directly after informing her that this had happened to her, which she found quite traumatising. Is that normal procedure, that a victim would be forced to look at the evidence that something had happened to them?
Look, I sort of cringe internally as you're saying this to me. My answer will be in two parts, I think. Firstly, I'd like to say I would hope not. The exposure to those sort of crimes in that sort of systematic way is enough to create trauma in and of itself. I think with the case of Giselle, the police would have been quite concerned that she didn't have any knowledge of being raped almost 100 times. Now, from an investigative perspective, I suspect that they were trying to ascertain whether or not that was her in the video, and then whether or not she had some sort of repressed trauma that may well have been unleashed, if you like, by watching the videos. Look, my clinical forensic psychologist brain here is absolutely horrified at the notion of a victim survivor being re-exposed to this trauma in such a callous way. I don't think that this was in her best interest. She really needed to come to terms with the offending by itself, and perhaps then if she wanted to view the material, then that ought to have been something, at least in my opinion, that she should have had control over.
Something that's really difficult for us to understand is how the defence is positioning some of their questioning. And this is something that's been brought up many, many times where it comes to sexual assault survivors in court. And in this instance, they're asking her whether she was just pretending to be asleep in these videos and was she complicit in these sexual encounters, as they're calling them, sexual encounters rather than a rape. This seems abhorrent from our perspective when we think of the 70-odd men who were involved in this and the fact that it was so clearly documented, and that her husband has freely admitted that he did the wrong thing, and yet still the defence has to ask those questions?
Look, I don't think they have to ask those questions. I will say that in Australia we have the Uniform Evidence Act, and that we have very clear guidelines about how complainants, as we would call them in a legal sense, in sex cases are to be questioned and cross-examined. And certainly I would argue that those types of questions, at least in Australia, would no longer be permissible.
Brianna, if this sort of thing were to happen here, do you think it would change the way that we think about sexual assault and sexual assault victim survivors, the same way that it seems to be kind of reframing the conversation in France right now?
Yeah, I think inevitably it would lead to, the community thinking about whether the laws that we have currently are adequate to offer protections. It would have us thinking more about the, definition of a victim, if you like, in sexual assault cases. Here we have an example of a woman who had no knowledge but for the police bringing it to her. How do we then assist her to recover, to treat her with respect, while we're also assisting the sort of prosecution of these offenders and the very necessary legal trial that has to happen?
The trial of Dominic Pellicott, who's admitted to the abuse and the recruitment of strangers to assault his wife, is expected to last until December 20. If convicted, he and the other defendants could face up to 20 years behind bars. But this may not even be the end of legal troubles for Dominic. He's also facing separate charges for a 1991 murder and rape, which he denies, as well as an attempted rape in 1999 that he's admitted to after DNA evidence linked him to the crime. We'll update you once a verdict is handed down. The Quickie is produced by me, Claire Murphy, and our senior producer, Taylor Strano, with audio production by Tom Lyne.